Now, New Zealand soil scientists have been starting to explore how our soil carbon stocks are changing across a range of agricultural land uses and physical environments and the different on-farm management practices and their effect on our soil carbon. In this week's Farmers Weekly's Pulpit, Dr Paul Mudge continues a bit of a series on soil carbon from Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, and they're looking at data gathering to increase our knowledge of New Zealand's soil carbon stocks over a period of time. And Paul joins us now. Welcome to Sarah's Country, Paul. It's exciting the development that you are having with this piece of research. Before we go into where you're at and where you'd like to go, for those who aren't familiar around the science of measuring soil carbon, can you give us a little bit of a brief 101?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for inviting me on here. It's great to be here. So just soil carbon is often used almost synonymously with soil organic matter. So it's kind of it includes the organic debris from plant materials, microorganisms, all in the soil. And to measure it, you need to sample a known volume of soil with a known area of the land surface. So a known volume and a known mass of soil, and then you need to get the carbon concentration so that you can then express that carbon on a stock basis of tons of carbon per hectare is how it's usually expressed. And it's really important that you sample, generally the minimum is 30 centimetres if you're wanting to get at full carbon stocks, not just the topsoil, because that can be affected by cultivation, fluffing the soil up, or compaction. And so you've got to sample a reasonable portion of the soil profile, usually a minimum of 30, and we often go down to 60, and a metre would be great. Well, carbon's really critical for soil health, overall soil health. It's one of the glue that helps hold the soil together. It helps aggregation, which then helps porosity of the soil, helps water infiltrate, and like us, we rely on carbon. It's the energy that we get to move around and everything, and carbon is the basis of the soil food web. So it's critical for the earthworms and the microbes, which are really important for nutrient cycling and all of those processes that the soils carry out, making the nutrients available for the plants. So it's a really critical component of the whole soil ecosystem.
Why are we so behind the rest of the world in mapping our soil carbon?
I would say that we are particularly behind. We are behind some countries. For example, France have got a grid across the whole country, and they've sampled it very intensively. Denmark's done a very good job. We do have quite a lot of data, but it has been very piecemeal in that it's come from soil surveys done back from the 1950s through to the 1990s, and that was more to characterise the underlying soil resource, just to go what are the soils and the different characteristics of them. It wasn't explicitly to go how much carbon do we have and how is that changing. And so those sites were chosen by expert judgment by the pedologists that went out and sampled those soils, and so they're not spread evenly across the country, and they don't represent all of the soils, lands and landscapes in New Zealand. And so if you're coming at it from a much more statistical perspective, if you want to say actually how much carbon do we have and how is that changing, then you want to make sure that you've got an unbiased sample from the country.
And this is why it's a 12-year study, that length of time, funded by the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, so that it gives you that time to be able to measure on a national scale where we're at, because we have such young virgin soils here in New Zealand. And what will it be able to tell us in a change of land use on top of the soil as well?
So the national monitoring program that's been designed is 500 sites across agricultural land, and we've set that up over to be about 100 sites per each of the key land uses of dry stock on flat land, dairy on flat to rolling land, dry stock on hill country, horticulture, and intensive cropping land. And so we'll representatively sample 100 sites across all of those land uses, and we'll do about 100 and 25 sites for the first 4 years, and that'll give us our benchmark. And so we'll say this is how much carbon we've got, and then the reason that we need to go back and wait for 12 years is we'll then go back after 4 years is the plan, and sample again, and then go back 4 years after that. And if we go, that gives us time to measure if there has been changes, and if you get more than, if you could go back after 4 years and see if things have changed. But if you get 3 points, you'll be much more certain if there are any changes over time, and it allows a longer time for changes to occur.
I was finding here in an example that you gave in the pulpit, which is in this week's Farmers Weekly, and of course has some great in-depth on the soil monitoring process around it if you're interested further in being involved. But it's in terms of the change in soil carbon of about 2 tonnes per hectare as in a typical dairy farm. I mean, is that considerable, and is it worth actually measuring 2% in change?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think there's two different things here. What I was just describing was the national scale monitoring. So it's like at the national scale, we're going to monitor to see if it's changing, and that's important for New Zealand to be able to say to our international markets, our carbon is either at steady state or it's increasing or hopefully not decreasing. So we can just kind of say this is where we're at, and we actually know. We can kind of go, yeah, we're confident of this. At the moment, we're not sure. At the farm scale, a 2%, a 2 tonne change is about 2% on average, because we've got about 100 tonnes in our carbon, tonnes of carbon on average in our top 30 centimetres of dairy of New Zealand soils. So the question was, is it worth measuring that change? Was that what you asked?
Yeah, it seems so small, and the relevance of it when there is sequestration of carbon from our atmosphere into our soils has been poo-hooed so far that there's basically not too much room left in the tank to be able to do that. I mean, do we already have soil carbon that is of considerable nature, and measuring that small amount of 2% change, is it really worth that considerable science investment to do so?
At an individual farm scale, that's up to a farmer to make that decision. The jury is still out whether in New Zealand we can actually increase soil carbon. We know that we can change it with changes in land use. If you go from pasture to cropping, for instance, it will almost certainly go down. If you go the other way, it will increase. And there's still research trying to work out, can we increase the soil carbon? Now, for an individual currently, to do that and make those measurements in New Zealand, there is no government mechanism to receive payment or benefit for doing that. There is the opportunity to go into international voluntary markets and be paid for that if you can prove that you have increased your soil carbon. And the methods are out there, it can be done, but you've got to be really clear about what the objective, what you're trying to achieve, before you jump into doing that.
The reason I'm asking for that is our next guest to close the show, Bradley Case, on the front page of Farmers Weekly this week, is talking about how sheep and beef farms here in New Zealand need formal recognition of being carbon neutral in their on-farm sequestration. What work is Manaaki Whenua doing with He Waka Eke Noa in bringing that together around that regulatory framework?
I've been involved in a number of discussions with He Waka Eke Noa to have that explicit discussion around what do we do about soil carbon. I've got a discussion, I think it's later this week or the next week, to say this is what we know and this is where the science is at. You can make the measurements. What does policy do within that? And what do we recommend to farmers? So yes, there's pretty clear rules around the vegetation and guidelines around how that's done. Soil it's a bit harder to quantify directly, and the science is not as advanced to have a look-up table and say we're confident this will happen if you plant this. If you plant these trees in this environment, you will get this carbon sequestration. There's quite good data for that. We're not that far advanced for the soil side of things yet.
Paul, one of my favourite things I like to do on Serious Country is ask scientists political questions. And I do apologise as we're going into an election, but How important is it that we bring government to the table around protecting our soils? And have we made progress there on a national soil policy statement to protect our very unique and special soil profiles as a soil scientist yourself?
I think that's pretty critical, and I know that a lot of colleagues, I haven't directly been involved, but a lot of colleagues here at Manaaki Whenua have contributed to that highly productive soils piece of legislation, because everyone recognises that it's those critical soils that are just great for food production. They're very versatile. You can use them for a whole range of different crops. We've got to look after those and not build houses on them for our future food security. And it's just so much more sustainable to use a good soil for that than trying to add a lot of nutrients or drainage to a poor soil and then try and grow vegetation on that. So I think we should be trying to keep houses off those really elite soils in particular.
Oh, thank you so much. I always love talking to soil scientists, extremely passionate and knowledgeable. Dr Paul Mudge there from Manaaki Whenua at Landcare Research, following the national mapping funding that is going on to map our soil carbons at a national level, as well as the ability to do that in an on-farm level over the process of 12 years.
This is Sarah's Country.